Find the character you relate to in the story. But I invite you to listen and not read along in any Bible, unless it just really helps you to do that. We are in Luke chapter 15. By this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently. The Pharisees and religion scholars were not pleased, not at all pleased. They growled, "He takes in sinners and eats meals with them, treating them like old friends." Their grumbling triggered this story. Jesus said, "Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and lost one. Wouldn't you leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the lost one until you found it? When found, you can be sure you'd put it across your shoulders, rejoicing. And when you got home, call in your friends and neighbors and say, 'Celebrate with me. I found my lost sheep.' Count on it. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner's rescued life than over 99 good people in no need of rescue." Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and she loses one. Does she not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me. I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food and food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." Some versions say, "and kissed him and kissed him." The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. This son of mine was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and sulked and refused to join in. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, "Look how many years I've stayed here serving you." Some versions say slaving for you. "Never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours who's thrown away your money on whores shows up and you go all out with a feast? His father said, "Son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time, and we had to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. He was lost, and he's found." May the Lord bless the reading of his word.
Child of God, so dearly loved and ransomed by the Savior's blood, and called by name, daughter and son, wrapped in the robe of righteousness. So come home running, his arms are open wide. His name is Jesus, and he understands. He is the answer you are looking for. So come home running, just as you are.
A few days ago, I was out running around and doing things, getting some things taken care of, and bumped into this young lady that just means so much to me. Hadn't seen her in a good while, and we just threw our arms around each other, and we're just so thrilled to see each other. She had been a youth in my youth group a good while back, and I caught up with her about her family and what she was doing, and right in the middle of it, she said, "Susan, I'm not a heathen anymore." And I said, "Well, I never thought you were." She said, "Oh, yeah." And she didn't go into a lot of detail, but I knew what she meant. And you hear a thing or two here or there that you hope isn't true. But that had all changed. And she was leading a youth group, working with them. She was going on mission trips with them, like she used to go on mission trips with me. And she was so excited for what God was doing in her life. And her mother was joining her in worship, which hadn't happened a lot. The Lord had really been at work there. And I thought about her back in the youth group days. And she had been seemingly pretty strong. Strong in her faith and a good example. And I wondered about that heathen period she was talking about. But I was so grateful that she came home. I bet everybody sitting here who belongs to Jesus Christ this morning, whether it was before or after you committed your life to him, you've had a heathen period. You've been a prodigal. Even if you've been really, really good. And in fact, chances are good that sitting here today, we have more prodigals than we might think. Prodigal. The word prodigal means squanderer, waster. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But it's so easy to belong to the Lord, at least to say that we do, and yet to waste the life that we've been given. To try to have it somehow create it ourselves. And it becomes so frustrating and lonely and empty. There's only one place to not be wasting time, energy, effort, gifts, love. And that's when we're in the Father's house, when we're in the Father's love, when we're in relationship with the Father. But I digress a little bit. Jesus tells us right from the start what his intention is going to be, or I should say maybe Luke does, that Jesus is addressing certain people that are there. He has a goal of who he's aiming these parables at. And because we've called it the parable of the prodigal son, we tend to think of it as a parable for sinners. And truly, sinners could find much in it for themselves, but not the heathen type is not what he was after with this parable. Luke tells us right from the start, it says, he told this parable because he had been hanging around with those with a doubtful reputation, and the Pharisees and religious leaders were not pleased, and they were growling against him, that he spends time with them, that he eats with them even. He befriends them. And so Jesus starts telling these parables. The first one is about a lost sheep. Now, a sheep is a living thing, not a very smart living thing, going to have a hard time finding the master, and will do just about anything to take care of itself, which are not things at all to take care of oneself, like drinking water full of parasites, eating down to the dirt, wandering off of cliffs, getting stuck in brambles, really, really lost. And so Jesus tells the story of this one who is utterly helpless, this sheep, to find itself, to make itself be found. But then the shepherd finds that sheep, and there's a party. Then the second parable he tells is of a woman's coin. Now, unlike a sheep, a coin has no life in it. A coin would be beyond dead. And this coin doesn't even know that it's lost from its owner. It is who knows where. And the woman is desperate to get it back. And so, as with the shepherd, it becomes her focus to find that coin. And with both of these parables, he's saying to those Pharisees and scribes, don't you know God's love is like that? God's focus is that one who is away. God will stop at nothing to have that sheep back, to have that coin back, to be restored to that one again. A coin who could do nothing to help itself. A sheep that could do nothing to be found. And then there's the parable of the two sons and the father. The younger son, he's eager to be on his own. So he asks for a portion of the inheritance, his portion. It would be a third. The older brother would get 2/3. So the father takes and divides it. Now this request you need to know, and maybe you've heard, it was a real slap in the face to that father. It was to say, you're dead to me. You know, I kind of equate it to when I was little, and I'd say to my mom, Mom, when you die, can I have that ring? I mean, little children, they don't know what they're saying. But you get older, you get to be a young adult, and you say, Mom, when you die, can I have that ring? That's not going to be received very well. Well, this son, it's like, give it to me. I want what you're going to give me. I want it apart from you. So he took it, and he left. Very, very disrespectful. Well, he goes off, and he has a good time with that money. You know, the older son says, spend it on prostitutes. Well, we don't know what he spent it on. We just know he spent it all. It says wastefully. Well, you can waste your money on a lot of good stuff. It doesn't have to be sinful. Just waste. And waste, it could be certainly argued that sin in its own. But he gets to be where he's starving to death because a famine comes in and he doesn't have anything left anyway. So he goes and he takes the worst possible job for a Jew, feeding pigs. Now, you know, Jews do not eat pigs. They were an unclean animal. They had nothing to do with pigs. And here he is feeding them and wanting to eat what they're eating, which is these husks of these pods. Sounds awful. So he's got the lowest of the low job, and it's the way the Pharisees and scribes saw Jesus. What are you doing? Associating yourself, befriending, eating with these pigs, these sinners, these scum. What are you doing? Pharisees, you know, they were living the righteous life, the life that everybody should have been living if they wanted the Messiah to come. In fact, they had a saying that if all the Jews could observe perfectly 2 Sabbaths in a row, the Messiah would come. And so they're seeing Jesus as a big offender. You're one of the reasons the Messiah hasn't come. And he's standing right there in front of them, teaching them. So then Jesus is continuing. This son comes to himself. Now, I think we need to understand that the coming to himself is about an empty stomach, okay? He is saying, he's rehearsing, thinking that his father would never take him back as son. I guess I better at least just ask to be a servant. He's never going to receive me back. I don't even know if he's going to be glad to see me at all. And so he comes up with what he needs to come up with to be received home. Not to say that there isn't some sincerity in that, but I don't think it really comes home until his father's arms are around him And he's kissing him and kissing him. You know, the scripture doesn't say that the father interrupts what he's saying. He just stops speaking when his father has thrown his arms around him. So he heads home, probably rehearsing those lines. I'm not worthy. Will you just take me as your servant? And something else we need to know about that is a slave in a home was better off than a servant. A slave was owned, and you had to take care of them, and they had job security. They belonged to you as property. You weren't ever going to kick them out. But a servant could be fired. So he wasn't even asking for security. He was on a hope and a prayer that Dad would just see his state and have a little mercy on him. And see, back in that time, too, the neighbors, you know, they would have known what that younger son asked. And they would have been so appalled at that. And then to see him coming down the road in his bedraggled, horrible state, and then to see the father run to him. Well, I get ahead of myself again. But Jesus is saying, look, Pharisees, scribes, don't you see? These people can repent, just like this younger son. These people I'm spending time with, God loves them. And they're getting it. They're understanding what he means. And they're offended at it. Well, then the father. We turn to the father's story. He sees his son coming from a long way off because he's been looking forever for this day. He's been looking down the road for the longest time, yearning. I just want to see my son again. I just want to know he's alive again. Didn't care what he looks like. Didn't care what he'd been doing. Just come home. Have you been there? And so he sees that son, and overcome with joy, he just yanks up his robes and tears down the road. And this too was great, a great indignity to hike up his robes and run. I mean, a father, a Jewish father, the patriarch, worthy of all the respect in the family. This one is so undignified as to gallop down the road to that bedraggled thing that used to be his son. Filled with compassion. And the Pharisees would be saying, are you saying that God's love is that ridiculously lavish? Are you saying that God has no standards? So then the son, he tries to state his rehearsed confession. But like I said, the father calls for the servants. Let's get that robe. Let's get that ring. Let's get those sandals. And the robe said, you're my son. And the ring said, you have the authority as my son in this family. And the sandals said, you're no servant and you're no slave. You again are my son. He was restoring him to full position in the family. And this, of course, would have been deeply offensive to the Pharisees too. Because was Jesus really saying that all their faithfulness to the law, all the things that the Pharisees always did, that they didn't mean a thing to God? All that? They would have been shocked. They would have said, you're saying God's unjust. Are you saying that God would receive a sinner back as a son without even an apology? Without any penitent act? Then the father tells the servants, let's have a party. And the Pharisees would say, well, what about us? I mean, shouldn't God be celebrating us? We're the true sons. Well, then, we turn to the older son. He hears that party. And this is the one Jesus really wants them to focus on. because they're all the older sons. And he refuses to come in that party, and the father, again, losing dignity, goes and begs, and he says, come join us. You know, your brother's back. We have to celebrate. But the Pharisees think, I'd want no part of that party. What party are we supposedly missing anyway, Jesus? Party for sinners? The young man accuses his father of unfairness. You've never given me a party, but this son of yours, he's been out wasting everything you gave him on prostitutes, and you give him a party? Well, I've been slaving for you, Father. And that's how the Pharisees saw it. It wasn't that they did all those things out of love for God. It was so that people could look at them and say, look how good, look how righteous they are. But they weren't doing it anything for the joy of it, for the love, like I said, of the Father, of God. It was all for their own self-righteousness and their own reputation, the praise of people. Like the older son, the Pharisees had been with God in body, if you will, but not in spirit. The Father's blessings had always been available to them if they had only ever been with the Father. But they'd been into themselves. How do you think the story ended? Do you think the older son ever went in? Have you found yourself in the story? Frank Honeycutt, preacher, blogger, he said that they were all three wasters. All three characters were wasters in the story. Father, son, older son. The younger son, of course, he wasted, obviously, everything he was given on a smorgasbord of sins, probably. Wasted it on fellow partiers, the fair weather friends. Wasted it with no thought of his future. Wasted it with no thought of his father's honor or reputation or his own. And the Father, thank God, his love is so lavish. His love holds nothing back. Those Pharisees would say, well, he wasted his inheritance on this unfaithful son. And he wasted his time watching for his son's return. And he wasted his dignity, hiking up those robes and running to meet him. And he wasted his love on this worthless son by also giving him the robe and the sandals and the ring and the party. A party? And he wasted his reputation when all those neighbors looked and said, what are you doing? You know, they could have stoned that son to death. And he wasted his breath begging his older son to come into the party. We have a Father who holds nothing back. And we need to understand that that son, either son, the coin, the sheep, we cannot do anything to save ourselves. We can't do anything to bring us into relationship with the Father. The Father runs to us in whatever state we're in, whether we're completely bereft, nothing, whether we return like the younger son or whether we stand realizing that all of our self-righteousness was was filthy rags. And all of that good behavior that we were doing wasn't really for the one that we should have been loving. It was for a sort of a self-love, a selfish love. To have the applause of others maybe, to be thought well of. And the older son, what was he wasting? He was wasting his blood, sweat, and tears out there in the fields, not just doing his work, but he was doing his brother's work too. And this father of mine, well, he plays favorites. I've been wasting my time on that. He was wasting his time with his own goodness on a father who was blind blind to see how worthless and undeserving his other son was. And he was wasting his efforts serving such a foolish father who actually loves the unworthy one, who actually gives rings to sinners. And he was wasting his memory, this older brother, though he didn't know it, keeping score, complaining about unfairness, harboring grudges, and waiting for others to earn his forgiveness and acceptance. So will the real prodigal please stand up? Which one is really the waster? You have one who lavishes love with no thought of how we failed. He's just glad to have us home. And we have one who was lost, but is now found and in the Father's arms and celebrating. But we have one who's still wasting so much time trying to control and earn the love of God, who is and who always has been crazy in love with him, but he doesn't know it. A long, long time ago, I had a youth in my youth group. His name was David. His father had been an alcoholic, abusive to his mother, left them. David was the only son. He was the one who was the man of the house when his father left. He took that very seriously, and he strove to be so good. He supported his mother so much, and when he was in the youth group, he was the automatic leader. He could spout Bible verses, and he could pray beautiful prayers, and everyone spoke so well of David and thought, wow, I wonder what God's going to do with this young man's life. A while later, I heard from him. At college, he'd found some new friends. He was addicted to alcohol, as his father had been. He was not doing well in school then and about to flunk out. And he said, Susan, I was so full of all the rules. Do this, don't do that. This is what a good person does. This is what a bad person does. And he said, and I don't think I ever really knew the Jesus I was so able to talk about. The older brother and the younger brother. So this morning I ask you again, who are you? And do you need to come home? Maybe you're in a far country. Or maybe you are coming to your senses. Or maybe you're home and you're celebrating. Or maybe you're still trying to figure out how to have a home without the Father in it. May God lead you in whatever decision He would have you to make in this time of invitation. And if anyone wants to share a decision with me, I'll be down front as we sing our hymn of invitation.